Threat actors are constantly evolving their attack methods, which requires leaders in the private and public sectors to always reevaluate the effectiveness of their security strategies. I'm Wyatt Cash with Scoop News Group and CyberScoop, and joining us to talk about some of those ideas and some of the most recent strategies available now to combat those threats is Jim Richberg, Public Sector Field CISO and Vice President of Information Security at Fortinet. Jim, thank you so much for joining us. Always a pleasure speaking with you.
I always enjoy talking with you, Wyatt.
Well, I think it's helpful as we move into 2022. What do you see now as the biggest risks in the threat environment today for private and public sector organizations?
So Wyatt, the biggest risks are not looking at this holistically. No one is an island. Partnership is necessary. Don't reinvent the wheel, whether it's between public and private sector, whether it's the kind of technologies you bring to bear on this. You mentioned threat, and I like talking about threat, but when I have the same conversation with an organization for the fifth time on threat, it makes me realize this is actually a symptom of a bigger problem they have in terms of cyber threat intelligence, that either they don't get enough of it, they don't know what to do with it. So what are the threats that people are facing today that really are top of mind? I think ransomware is still top of mind for many. Certainly in the public sector, we have seen that it is something that can bring an organization to its knees. We don't want to pay the ransom, but if you don't, you run the risk of essentially having your organization paralyzed for a long period of time. I think given what's happened this year in the geopolitical context, I am increasingly hearing from organizations in the public sector and the private sector organizations that are supporting them, am I in the potential crosshairs of nation-state conflict, or am I going to get caught in the crossfire? Am I going to be collateral damage of something happening on the other side of the world? And these two things actually converge, Wyatt, because ransomware has been the problem that persists, a problem that always has a fairly consistent payoff for the criminals. So we talk about nation states, we often use the term APT, advanced persistent threats, because they bring a lot of sophistication to bear. We're now starting to see APC, advanced persistent crime, because the fact that the revenues have been relatively constant from ransomware means that groups that normally would come together, do something when technology changed and the exploit stopped working, they would go off and join other collectives. They now stay together. So this persistence allows them to become more specialized and more sophisticated. So some of the criminal groups, not all, but some of them are now starting to take on the degrees of sophistication and clandestinity we used to only associate with nation state activity.
And how else have you seen the larger threat environment evolving from just a year ago?
So Wyatt, I think one of the things that it's related a little bit to the institutionalization of ransomware, but the overarching thing that I've seen is much more destructive malware than we saw a year ago. Yes, you could say that given what's happening in Ukraine, given the fact that NotPetya in 2017 became what is often considered the most destructive piece of global malware ever used, launched into Ukraine, but very predictably and rapidly spread globally, you would say this is potentially not surprising coming, from in the context of nation state activity. But the thing is, we're also seeing more destructive ransomware. Sometimes you look at things and you say, not only are they looking for ransom, even if I pay it, they're wiping some of my data out. The thing that has struck me is the environment, even on the criminal side, is increasingly one that is seeing wiperware, is seeing things that are going to take your data and publish it. Even if you pay them, they're still going to share your data with your competitors. They're going to sell it on the dark web. Things that we look at it and say, this is a more Hobbesian world, a nastier cyber environment than we were facing on the threat side a year ago.
Well, in light of that, what, say, 3 or so proactive cyber strategies should IT leaders keep in mind?
Well, Wyatt, let me caveat this by saying proactive does not mean offensive. We're not saying hack back. We're not saying do anything like that. But and let me give them to you in order from easy to hard. Plan and exercise. You don't want the first time you have to think about a problem being when you're dealing with the real cyber exercise. Even doing a tabletop exercise, if you're the private sector, doing it with your board, saying, well, we're missing a key stakeholder. Who would we call if we needed external counsel or incident response capability? Within government, similarly saying, all right, how are we cooperating with our public sector partners as well? The second one is network. And I tell this to the private sector all the time. Do things like join the local FBI InfraGard chapter. Within government, know who in CISA and the FBI to talk to. You don't want the first time you have a conversation with someone being when you have to tell them about a problem you have. Trust exists between people, and trust is built up through routine action. So getting to know your counterparts is a very important thing. The number one need I hear from people in the public sector is on the value of a trusted advisor, someone who can tell them about things that would work, ways they can make investments that are going to give them more bang for the buck, that may be more future-proof. How do you find these people? Well, it's not by Googling them. It's by getting out and actually collaborating with people and finding, I like what this person says. It's unbiased advice. That's what you do. And the final one, if you're an organization that's fairly sophisticated in its capability, would be deception technology. We think of deceptions and we think of honeypots and decoys, the things we put on our network that help us find an adversary who is stealthy and who got past all of our defenses, but they hit this honeypot we have out there that an innocent user would not find. This ignores the fact that it's not just a pass-fail thing. Using deception technology also affects an intruder's behavior. It's like having this home protected by sign outside your house. It doesn't matter whether you actually have an alarm system or not. A lot of people are going to be deterred. Someone who does decide to break in is going to behave and proceed differently, more slowly, do different things than if they just thought, this is an unprotected home, I can smash the window and come in. Interesting things happen. Intruders start doubting the part of the network you thought that you forgot to protect. They assume if they think you have deception technology, that's the honeypot. There's a placebo effect. If they know you have the technology, even when you're not using it, they're almost as deterred as if they're working in the face of it. So I call this one the intersection of computer science, behavioral science, and medical science, because there's actually a herd immunity issue to this too. So those are the things that I would tell organizations to do that could be proactive, help them get ahead of a particular incident.
And in contrast, how would you frame, say, 3 defensive strategies that agencies and the private sector really need to be thinking about now to thwart these newer attacks?
Well, number one is the perennial backup and patch. You've got to have those timely offline backups, and you've got to be routinely patching everything you have. The second one I would say is use multi-factor authentication. Certainly, we all saw the value of that when we went to remote. Now that we're back in hybrid or work from anywhere, again, we need to do that, especially in conjunction with the third thing I'd recommend, which is think seriously about zero trust architecture. If you're in the federal government, you don't even have the choice. The Executive Order 14028 basically said you're going to do it, gave you a timeline to do it. So zero trust becomes a good way to both minimize the likelihood of being compromised and then minimizing the consequences if you are being compromised. And I'll give you an extra credit piece of advice as well, because while we have seen ransomware grow, we've also seen it morph. It not only encrypts your data, they now steal your data, as I said when we talked about its destructive capabilities. So look at encryption of data at rest. There's been a requirement to do it. We haven't universally implemented it, but isn't that poetic justice that when someone comes in to steal your data as part of ransomware, you say, it's already encrypted, you can't do anything with it. And there are a lot of commercial solutions that can help agencies implement that kind of capability.
Well, those sound some like very good pieces of advice, as always. Jim Richberg, we really appreciate your taking some time to join us and share your observations and insights on better securing organizations' networks. So thank you for being with us.
Wyatt, it was a pleasure.